Hanging out with Clement
on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
On our World of Work feature, we're talking about this trend that seems to be emerging. It's called quiet firing. We've spoken about quiet quitting before. Today we're telling you about quiet firing. There are a lot of companies that are downsizing or are restructuring due to maybe the change in the global economy dynamics. And this has led to this emergence of quiet firing, right? Where companies are now letting you go because they want to reduce the size of the workforce without having to pay severance packages. And the tactic sometimes includes creating circumstances for you as an employee, circumstances that make it unbearable for you so that in the workplace, so that you voluntarily resign. And one of the questions that came to my mind as I was thinking about quiet firing was, how different is it from constructive dismissal? And experts are arguing that quiet firing is actually quite harder to identify than constructive dismissal, which is more common. So how do you protect yourself from that? And where can there even be accountability for employers that get involved or engaged in quiet firing? If this is something you've experienced yourself and you were able to identify that what I've been through with that employer was quiet firing, because when you look at their strategy, they were downsizing, they were looking at restructuring, and they just wanted to create an environment where you are pushed out, you resign voluntarily, and then they don't have to pay your severance package. But actually, this was the plan to get you out anyway. I want you to share those experiences with us. Or maybe you've got questions about how to deal with a company where you've just experienced that. 011-883-0702 is the number to dial. You can send your WhatsApps as well on 0727021702. We've invited Advaita Naidoo, who's the Africa MD at Jackhammer Global, to guide us through this conversation and take some of your questions. Advaita, thank you for making time. Good morning.
Thanks for having me back, Clement.
Yeah. Maybe let's start by just once again explaining what exactly we mean by this term quiet firing. We've heard of quiet quitting before, and now quiet firing is really a trend that's beginning to emerge. What does it involve?
So I think there's probably a feeling that it might be just another buzzword that's being thrown around. So I don't want to make it seem that it's a sensational exposure. I do want to note that it is subtle, like you said. It's tricky to define and identify, and because we don't have any statistics on it just yet, it does seem like it's a bit of an amorphous concept because you can't really prove that it's what it was. So just to put it against constructive dismissal for a second, constructive dismissal is marked down as a category as covered in processes by the CCMA. It's usually targeted at a single person, and the requirements are clear. The workplace situation must have become quite intolerable that the employee has no choice but to resign. But if we looked at what's been termed as quiet firing, somebody may look at that and say, well, actually, you did have a choice. And the way it's been conceptualized or written about, as you mentioned, it mostly comes into play when a company wants to go through a downsizing or a restructure, and they typically face very time-consuming and expensive bureaucratic hurdles to do that, on top of the severance packages that they would be needed to provide. So the behaviors they engage in are just enough to make teams feel uncomfortable and look at alternatives. And probably the most common example of this is that companies will insist that people return to the office full-time, whereas they've been working off-site for a while due to COVID, and it'll often make it untenable or impractical for employees to comply because they've either moved further away or the cost of the commute has increased beyond what their salary has increased over the past couple of years. So it's these little strategies in place. It doesn't go against a contract because if you think about it, your contract was probably structured that says you are expected to be in office.
And it's never changed even when COVID came.
It is unlikely to have changed.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's difficult to prove that was the motivation. But, I can say, Mark Zuckerberg has been recorded as saying self-selection is okay with me. And I've certainly chatted to an executive or two who hold the view that, well, if they're the type of people who only want to work from home, well, then, they're not the right people for us, and that's fine. So, yes, this term is new and catchy, but it's not really an unknown concept. It's just, kind of tentacling its way into the corporate context.
Yeah.
somewhat unnoticed.
Yeah, I have had a chat with some of my friends who have also been told come back to the office, and they're feeling that's the company really trying to push them out. I mean, there's some who are already looking for other opportunities outside the company because they are simply not prepared to go back to the office. But as you say, it gets tricky because if your contract hasn't changed, contractually you're still obliged to be in the office should the executive or the managers decide that that's the way to go now going forward. The question though, Advaita, is how different is that then from constructive dismissal? Because isn't constructive dismissal all about creating an environment that at some point it's going to be so unbearable that as an employee you just want to leave?
Well, again, I suppose the difference is that, when constructive dismissal, an independent arbiter is going to look at that and say, yes, these were unilateral changes to the terms of your employment, and it's usually targeted at a single person. Or it's harassment or bullying or discrimination. It's a very hostile work environment, or they're unsafe working conditions. There are a couple of points that are noted there as absolutely egregious, and an independent arbiter is going to look at that and say, yes, definitely, this is not on, and the employee had no choice but to leave. But the more insidious and the subtle and the nuanced examples of quiet firing, it's, withholding a raise or a promotion. And it's not, if you look at your KPIs, they're somewhat met, but an employer could be justified in not giving you the raise or the promotion because you're just middling along, or according to them, you're middling along, or isolating them from team activities or decision-making processes, or giving them just grunt work. It makes the daily grind unbearable. And again, it's not that it's against whatever's written in their contract. It's just it's something that makes them unmotivated. And another thing that happens is micromanagement and increasing the bureaucracy around what they're doing, not providing feedback or support, overwork or underwork. So these are things that can be addressed if an employee chooses to go to HR. And incorporate it into a performance improvement plan, or incorporate it into proper performance review, but not necessarily to be able to take it to an independent body and say, well, they're making my work life unbearable.
Yeah. Why do companies do this? I said earlier that, some of the reasons could very well be that they don't want to pay those severance packages. So it's much easier for you to just resign voluntarily than they announce that, okay, we've got this restructuring plan and we have to cut down, because then there's a bigger responsibility on their side. What is the driving force behind companies that are trying to get rid of people through quiet firing without following the right process, especially if they are restructuring?
Sure. So, primarily it would be the severance packages that would be expected to pay out, but also going through a downsizing or a structure, that is time consuming and that is expensive. So, apart from having to go through the legal frameworks of the Section 189, the organizational change that's required, this could actually just very well be a first step to say, well, let's do this and see who decides to move on, and then put into place any other measures. But again, it's the process that's lengthy. It requires a lot of steps, and it takes people's attention away from other core work to be done.
Got it. I got it. All right. 011-883-0702. I want to give our listeners an opportunity to weigh in on this. Maybe this is something that you have experienced in your company. You realize that maybe they were telling you to come back to the office, even when it wasn't just making sense, because you're still quite equally productive at home, or maybe you had moved, the circumstances were different for you, but they didn't want to understand that, even though that didn't really impact on your delivery. Or maybe they were withholding a position or a raise, or they didn't promote you, even though that was the promise before. And you realize much later on that, this company was actually trying to downsize, or they were trying to restructure, but they were creating this environment so that I voluntarily resigned without being honest about what the company's positioning is, and where the company is headed. What have been your experiences about this? 011-883-0702. I've got WhatsApps as well coming through on 072-702-1702.
I think one of the harshest ways, the quiet firing that I realized after the fact, is a thing called Personal Improvement Program, PIP or PIP. it just frustrates you to a point where you're like, I actually am being micromanaged and I just want to leave and I'm being treated like an idiot. So you just end up leaving, only to realize that a week later they hire somebody else or they restructure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so weird. Yeah, Advaita, like that happens to you, and then you realize, oh, I mean, there's no way that it's a coincidence that you were treated like that, and there's just so much basically pushed out, only for the company a week later or so to say, it's now restructuring. Because they could argue that, well, when that happened to you, it wasn't really part of our plan to restructure. This is just a decision we've only just taken now.
Yeah, and it's hard to see it in the moment, right? Because when you're in it, you're kind of you're doing everything you can according to this performance improvement plan. But I think to go back to the point about the cost saving measure, I think it can be a cost saving measure in the short term for them, but the long term consequences just outweigh the immediate financial benefits. Because when employees feel undervalued, they don't just quietly leave; they will disengage first. And as soon as somebody is put on a plan like that, and it doesn't seem like there is any improvement despite their best efforts, this silent withdrawal will go to lower productivity, this loss of institutional knowledge, and really ultimately reputational damage for the company, because the short-term to medium-term performance will harm longer-term organizational reputation and credibility.
Yeah, I've got some people saying this is something that they've experienced, and the question they're asking is, how do we protect ourselves? Like, what kind of protection do employees have if they maybe even suspect that they're being quietly pushed out?
Yes, I mean, I think requesting and advocating for a transparent work environment and having expectations clarified probably reduce the likelihood of being quietly fired. I know in a lot of ways that puts the onus on the employees, and I will get to the employers just now. It may feel a bit transactional, but it really helps to document your work, especially accomplishments and positive feedback. And with every project milestone that you meet, or at every opportunity for review, make sure that your manager is still engaging positively and giving you those positive reviews. Keeping the detailed records and the communication patterns really help. And then having the direct conversations, clarify the expectations, seek feedback, bring issues to light to make sure that anything that is not satisfactory is being addressed as soon as possible. And then I know a lot of listeners seeking support through HR often feels a bit troubling, because a lot of people feel that HR operates on the behalf of the company. And yes, to a certain extent they do, but also raising the issue and spotlighting it as a concern means that it's out in the open. So it's just that much harder to hide. And then I'm afraid if the work environment really does become unsustainable, seeking a new role before reaching the breaking point is really probably the best protective thing you can do for your mental health, because you deserve to work in an environment where you are treated with dignity and respect. And this thing of quiet firing, it can be difficult to prove.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to Sean, who's calling us from Johannesburg. Sean, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
I was working for a company, and out of the blue, my manager came to me and said to me, "Listen, the numbers are down. This is a school environment. The numbers are down. So we're putting you from working full week, full salary. We're putting you onto half week, half salary, and then we'll review it in 3 months' time." And this just carried on without review for almost 2 years, up to the point where I just couldn't carry on anymore. They expected a full week's worth of work out of me in a half a week, complained when things weren't getting done to their satisfaction, but they've just given me half the time to do it in. And were paying me half a salary. Your expenses don't change. Everything is the same, but now you're supposed to survive on a half a salary.
And do you think that was more constructive dismissal, Sean, where they're trying to make the environment difficult for you, or because there was a bigger plan in the company to maybe downsize or cut the number of people, and they just wanted you guys to leave without?
Look what they were doing. They were when people were leaving, they weren't replacing them, so the workload on everybody else doubles, including myself. And then what was happening is they weren't reviewing anything. So they doubled the workload. was the staff were getting less and less, and everybody was being forced to leave. They were just making it miserable for everybody.
Yeah, Sean. Thank you for sharing that with us, man, and I'm sorry about what's happened to you. Advaita, there's another example. And I suppose what's difficult here is that sometimes it's going to be tricky to be able to prove quiet firing, right? As opposed to how you would with constructive dismissal.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert, so I can't make a pronouncement on, whether one was the other. But I mean, that does sound like a really terrible position to be in, and that does sound like a unilateral change on his contract. So I mean, it could go either way, really. But that sounds like a company really taking advantage of somebody who had no other choice.
Yeah. Do you think that the workplace culture in South Africa makes people more vulnerable to quiet firing?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a huge unemployment rate, and people are worried about what their alternatives are, and so might choose to stick it out in an untenable environment, hopefully while trying to find something else. But employers also need to realize that, unless they go and put the proper steps in place, anyone who is being quietly fired, again, as I said, is going to be disengaged. So, they need to really balance out what's important, having a disengaged workforce or, retrenching people in the proper and appropriate manner and allowing them the opportunity to go and find something else.
Okay. And some advice for employers who may find themselves doing this because they thought, it's much easier for us to do, and they're maybe not even aware of the consequences it has.
So, apart from the legal and ethical responsibility to create and maintain a safe working environment based on fair conditions, anyone who employs someone has that responsibility. But I think there's also a bigger concern about learning to lead better. In some instances, managers just don't know how to manage diverse teams. That means multi-generational, people who are in different phases of life, men and women, cultural diversity, neurodiversity, and, as well as managing remote teams or people who work asynchronously. And a lot of leaders theoretically know what it means, but don't necessarily put guardrails or strategies in place to handle these. And so when it comes to unintentionally engaging in quiet firing, before we get to the ethical problems of them doing it on purpose, I think a lot of managers are just ill-equipped to lead these days. And, quiet firing could very well happen with creating a disengaged workforce because you have disengaged leaders.
Yeah. Let me just wrap up with these messages that have come through. Hi, Clement. Certain management is just not decent. They will not pick. They will nitpick at everything, even your breathing rate, micromanaging adults to frustrate you to leave. Corporate is not for the faint-hearted. Another one says, Clement, a friend of mine was told the company he's working for was downsizing, and as a result, they were being let go, only to find out no one else in her department was told that. And she was also told this through the WhatsApp group, which is really, really, really quite questionable. Advaita Naidoo, Africa MD at Jack Hammer Global, thank you for guiding us through this conversation.
Hanging out with Clement
on 702.
Let's walk the talk.